The speakers that recorded your favorite albums almost all came out of the same factory in Los Angeles. The man who founded that factory died without solving the problem he set out to solve. His company needed 6 more decades to finish the job, and it only got there once it stopped chasing the one thing everybody else was measuring. From the 1937 Iconic to the 7 Series, 23 studio monitors, 80 years of design, in order in one place. And an album is 150 hours of studio time at $150 an hour. When the monitor lies, you pay for it twice. We all assume a good monitor is one that sounds good. JBL built its name on the opposite. A studio monitor isn't there to flatter you, it's there to snitch. And in the 1940s, the speakers hanging in American control rooms did the exact opposite. They forgave. The industry standard was the Altec 604, a 15-inch coaxial with a small multi-cell horn mounted right in the middle of the cone. Almost every major studio in the country had a pair built into the front wall, behind the glass, aimed at the console. On paper, elegant. In practice, that design colored the mid-range and scattered the treble differently depending on where you were sitting. 2 engineers in the same room, a foot and a half apart, were not hearing the same record. So nobody trusted their own room. You'd finish a mix, dump it to a little speaker, and listen again. Some guys walked out to the parking lot and played it on a car radio. That habit sounds like superstition now. It was a diagnosis. The main system in the control room could not be trusted. And here's the part almost nobody tells you. The 604 came off the desk of a Los Angeles engineer named James Bullough Lansing in 1943. The man who would spend the rest of his life trying to replace that speaker had designed it himself. Audio historians still argue over exactly who deserves what share of the credit, because it was a team effort. But his name is on the work, and his name was on the door. Lansing had been building speakers since 1927, with a partner named Ken Decker. In 1937, he introduced the Iconic, a 2-way system with a 15-inch woofer in a bass reflex cabinet and a compression driver on a multi-cell horn, 30 Hz to 15,000. It is the first studio monitor in history. Les Paul kept a pair in his. Then in 1939, Decker was killed in a plane crash. Without the man running the business side, the company went under, and in 1941 it was sold to Altec. The name became Altec Lansing. Lansing stayed on as a vice president. 2 years later, he signed the 604. He lasted until 1946. The day his contract ran out, he walked and opened his own factory in San Marcos, California. And here's what almost nobody admits. The first 2 products that came out of that factory were near copies of Altec products. So let's not oversell the legend. The company that would go on to redefine the studio monitor started out copying. The next year brought the D130, a 15-inch with a 4-inch flat-wire voice coil, the first of its kind. And that's where the original work started. But the company never turned a profit while he was alive. In 1949, at 47 broke, James B. Lansing took his own life. He left behind a principle and no product that lived up to it. And to fix that, his company was going to have to copy one more time. The fix wasn't a better speaker. It was a closer one. If the problem was the room, the reflections, the walls, the ceiling, there was a way to sidestep all of it. Put the speaker so close to the engineer that almost everything reaching his ears is direct sound, and almost none of it is bounce. Forget burying huge cabinets in the back wall. Take a box the size of a suitcase and set it on top of the console, 5 feet from his face. JBL already had a big horn-loaded monitor fighting for space in control rooms. We'll come back to it in a minute. And it was that speaker's success that opened the door to the rest of the studio. The answer was the 4310. 3 ways in a cabinet 2 feet tall and 50 pounds heavy. A 12-inch woofer, a 5-inch mid-range, and a cone tweeter. All direct radiating, no horn. You could hang it, shelf it, or set it on the console. And it worked. Not because it measured better than the big boys, but because it took the room out of the conversation. Small studios got it first. They couldn't afford to treat a control room properly, and suddenly they didn't have to. Now, the second time JBL copied Altec. The 4310 wasn't designed to correct the 604. It was designed to imitate it. The stated goal was to replicate the 604's frequency response in a compact package. Sit with that for a second. The speaker that was going to unseat the industry standard was built by copying the sound of that same standard, which had been designed by JBL's own founder. Because engineers back then didn't want a new speaker. They wanted the one they already knew, minus the room. JBL didn't win by selling more truth. It won by selling the same truth, closer. And then something happened that JBL never planned for. People wanted one at home. At the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago in 1970, JBL launched the home version, the L100 Century. Inside, essentially the same speaker. Outside, a sculpted foam grille with a waffle cell pattern. The Quadrex, in burnt orange, dark blue, or black. With the grills on, it didn't look like audio gear. It looked like furniture from a science fiction movie. $273 each in 1973, 55 pounds apiece, and more than 125,000 pairs sold. The best-selling loudspeaker from any company for the entire decade. Here's the detail that explains almost everything. Huge numbers of people bought the L100 without knowing what a studio monitor even was. They bought it because it looked good in the living room. And yet that living room ended up with the same box that sat in the control room, where the record playing on it had been mixed. By accident, JBL had pulled off something no manufacturer had managed before. It closed the loop between the studio and the listener. But the success created a new problem, and it was serious. JBL's professional monitor had turned into a living room speaker. Inside the company, there was real concern. If the 4310 was sitting in every college apartment in America, it stopped reading as a serious tool. Professional credibility leaked out a little every time somebody used one to blast rock records. So in 1974, JBL split the line in two. The L100 kept the home market. The studios got the 4311, a successor designed from the ground up as professional gear. The changes weren't cosmetic. The 4310 had a front sub-baffle that, as it turned out, wasn't delivering the acoustic benefit everyone assumed. It was deleted. The tweeter dropped to a smaller diameter unit with a foam surround to widen dispersion and cut edge diffraction. The upper crossover point came down from 7 kHz to 6. The original woofer gave way to a 221, professionally built, with more power handling. The mid-range got its own sealed back chamber so it would stop fighting with the woofer. And the presence and brilliance controls moved to the front, where you could actually reach them. Because nobody in a studio is going to wrestle 50 pounds of cabinet around to nudge a pot. It worked. Survey after survey in the trade magazines started putting JBL monitors ahead of everybody else in studio market share. So within a few years, the company Lansing had left bankrupt, owned both the most used monitor in the business and the best-selling home speaker of the decade, and they were the same design. But that little box on the console was never the studio's main monitor. It was the check speaker, the second pair. Back on the wall, behind the glass, there was a much bigger system fighting a completely different war. And that system is what made everything you just heard possible. The 4310 won the console. But the console was never the main front. In a big studio, the real work happened on the mains. The monitors built into the wall behind the glass. The ones that had to fill an entire room at a volume that could buckle your knees. The Altec 604 had owned that spot for 20 years. And a 50-pound box had no business there. The speaker JBL sent after that spot was the 4320, 100 pounds. Twice the 4311, and this time it copied nobody. The 4320 dropped the coaxial idea completely. A 15-inch woofer, the T215B, handling everything below 800 Hz. A 2420 compression driver on a horn handling everything above. 2 ways, 2 specialists, each with one job. The trouble with a horn is that it fires treble like a spotlight. Lots of energy, almost no spread. The engineer in the sweet spot hears it perfectly. The producer on the couch behind him is hearing a different record. JBL's fix was an acoustic lens. Mounted across the mouth of the horn, the 2391, 11 metal vanes tilted at 38 degrees, spaced about a quarter inch apart. Sound passes through, diffracts, and comes out fanned wide. A diffuser bolted onto a spotlight. But what launched the 4320 wasn't a lens. It was who was in the room while it was being designed. The 4320 was developed with Capitol Studios in Hollywood, whose engineers wanted 2 specific things, more level and more low-end than the 604 could give them. And from there it crossed the Atlantic. EMI adopted it as its reference monitor in Britain. The same rooms where a huge chunk of the British catalog of the 60s had been cut, threw the Altecs off the wall. That's the speaker whose success convinced JBL it could sell monitors for every other room in the building. Without the 4320, there is no 4310. But the 4320 had a ceiling, and it was a physical one. 2 ways means a 15-inch cone has to carry everything up to 800 Hz by itself. And a cone that size moving that fast starts beaming and starts compressing the moment you ask it for level. In 1972, the 4325 arrived with the crossover moved up to lighten the woofer's load. It was a patch. The real answer was to split the spectrum 3 ways. The 4330 and 4331 kept the 2-way layout, but with a new woofer, the 2231. And then came the 4333. The same system with a 2405 sitting on top. A slot tweeter, a slit a few millimeters wide, spitting out the air and shimmer that two ways lose off the top. Those are the monitors that ended up in control rooms at NBC, CBS, and the BBC. And even then, JBL was about to discover a market where all of this counted as small. In 1973, JBL built a monitor without looking at the price tag. And that's not a figure of speech. The stated goal of the project was to create, regardless of cost, the ideal speaker for tracking sessions and for the final mixdown of master tapes. They called it the 4350. 4 ways, 2 15-inch woofers on the bottom, a 12-inch with its own sealed chamber for the low mids, isolated from the other two, a compression driver on a horn and lens for the upper mids, and the 2405 on top, 30 Hz to 20,000, within 3 dB. But the number that really defines it is a different one. You couldn't just plug it in. The 4350 was built for bi-amplification. The two woofers ran off their own amplifier, separate from the rest of the system. To make it play, you needed an electronic crossover and 2 power amps. You weren't buying a speaker. You were building an installation. In Japan, it cost close to ¥1,000,000. So the following year, JBL brought that technology down to a manageable size with the 4340 and the 4341. Same 4-way layout, a single 15-inch woofer, and a 10-inch low-mid developed from scratch for them. And a decision that says a lot about the era. They were the same speaker sold 2 ways. The 4340 for anyone with 2 amplifiers. The 4341, crossover built in, for everybody else. 2 years later, that design got refined into the model that changed everything. The 4343. And then something happened that nobody at JBL saw coming. Japan. The 4343 was sold as a professional tool. In Japan, it became a domestic cult object. Not in studios, in living rooms. And above all, in jazz kissa. The Japanese jazz cafes where people went to sit in silence and listen to records at volume, the way you'd go to a concert. In those rooms, JBL and Altec weren't an option. They were the standard. And here's the interesting part, because it runs against every commercial instinct there is. The 4343 had a reputation for being difficult. 4 ways, level controls on every section, optional bi-amping, and an enormous cabinet in homes that were not exactly spacious. Setting one up properly could take you years. And that difficulty, instead of scaring people off, is exactly what pulled them in. Owning JBL over there gets described as a martial art. Wrestling the thing until you tame it is part of the experience. They weren't buying it despite the hassle. They were buying it because of the hassle. Harman says so openly today. The 4343's reputation spilled past its own owners and became a cornerstone of high-fidelity culture across the entire country. The escalation kept going. In 1981, the 4345 arrived with an 18-inch woofer, developed specifically for it. And in 1982, came the 4343's direct successor, with a mass ring on the woofer to drop its resonance, and a blue baffle that gave it its nickname, Big Blue. The 4344 was the best-selling model of the whole series, and they had company. The 4301, the 4315, the 4355, with its mirror image pairs for mastering, and the entire bloodline of the 4311, the 4312, the 4312A, the 4312B. For 15 years, walking into a control room meant walking into a JBL catalog. But look at what's inside every single one of them, from the 4320 to Big Blue. The acoustic lens, tilted metal vanes, a solution from the 1950s, sitting in every one of these monitors for nearly 3 decades. And in 1981, an engineer who had just walked in the door at JBL was about to prove that the whole approach was wrong at the root. For 30 years, the entire industry measured speakers the same way. Put a microphone directly in front, 1 meter out, and see whether the response comes back flat. Don Keel came from Electro Voice, where between 1975 and 1979, he designed the first constant directivity horns. They were good enough that Altec copied them. And he showed up at JBL with an uncomfortable idea. That measurement everybody had been using describes about 1% of the problem. Because the engineer in the control room isn't only hearing what comes out the front. He's hearing that plus everything the speaker has thrown at the sidewalls, the ceiling, and the floor, coming back a fraction of a second later. If the response is flat on axis but mangled at 45 degrees, the room fills up with a bent version of the record. And the bent version is what reaches the ears. Now think back to the acoustic lens. Its job was to open up the beam. And it did. But it opened it differently at different frequencies. Wider here, narrower there. The speaker was covering a different angle on every note. So spreading the sound out more wasn't enough. It had to spread the same at every frequency. Keel's solution was to cross two radial profiles into a single piece. He called it biradial. Technicians, going by the shape, called it something else, baby butts. Also Dolly Partons. The numbers are the serious part. The 2344 horn covers 100 degrees horizontally and 100 vertically, and it holds that coverage constant from 1,250 Hz all the way to 16,000. The same window of sound, note after note, top to bottom. In 1981, JBL launched 3 monitors built around it: the 4425, the 4430, and the 4435. David Smith designed the 2 big ones. Greg Timbers designed the small one. And the 4435 hit a beautiful trick. It carries 2 15-inch woofers, but they don't do the same job. One covers 30 Hz to 1000. The other only works below 100. A normal bass driver, plus a second one dedicated entirely to the basement of the spectrum. The result? 115 to 120 dB, between 20 and 30 Hz. And none of this was marketing. In March 1981, the work was presented as a technical paper to the Audio Engineering Society. And in June 1983, it ran in full in their journal, credited to Smith, Keel, and John Ergel. In that paper, they compare the biradial against a previous generation radial horn and against an exponential horn with an acoustic lens, meaning JBL published, in a peer-reviewed journal, the proof that its own solution of the last 30 years was the worst of the 3. 21 years later, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences gave Don Keel a scientific and technical award for that work, an Oscar, for the shape of a horn. But while JBL was building 200-pound monitors for enormous control rooms, the recording studio was about to move into a bedroom. In the 1990s, the recording studio stopped being a building. The computer swallowed the console, the tape machine, and the machine room. All of a sudden, entire records were being mixed in bedrooms, in garages, in spare rooms with carpet and a closet behind you. Rooms no acoustician had ever touched. For a monitor manufacturer, that's a nightmare, because the room stops being a controlled variable and becomes anything at all. JBL's answer wasn't a speaker. It was a way of measuring. They called it linear spatial reference, LSR, and it's Keel's idea taken to its conclusion. If what reaches your ears is the direct sound plus everything that bounces, then measuring a speaker head-on at 1 meter tells you almost nothing about how it will behave in a real room. So they stopped taking one measurement, they started taking 72. 360 degrees around the speaker, covering the entire sphere of energy the thing throws into the room. 1,296 times more information than a single on-axis curve. And here's the part that says something about the company's character. Standard practice in the industry was to smooth the graphs, average out the peaks and dips so the curve looked clean in the brochure. JBL did the opposite. Smoothing hides data. LSR measurements were built to expose flaws, resonances, uneven dispersion, off-axis coloration. It's the only design philosophy I've seen framed as an uncomfortable question. Why do 2 speakers that measure exactly the same sound different? The first product shipped in 1998. The LSR-32. 3 ways, with a 12-inch neodymium woofer carrying 3 voice coils, 2 to move the cone, and a third acting as a brake, limiting excursion when the driver overreached. Kevlar mid-range, titanium tweeter, mounted in a waveguide. Notice the word, waveguide. It's no longer a lens that diffracts sound and scatters it. It's a surface that decides, point by point, where every frequency goes. But the LSR-32 still had 3 drivers and 2 crossover points, 2 seams. And at every seam, the radiation pattern jumped. The real target was something else, a 2-way system, 1 seam, and controlled dispersion from the bass to the last of the treble. And that needed a driver that didn't exist in 1998. That driver showed up in 2012, and it didn't show up in a studio. It was designed by an engineer named Alexander Voishvilo, and it went after a flaw the industry had spent decades treating as unavoidable. A conventional compression driver works like a piston. It shoves air with a rigid diaphragm. But at very high frequencies, that diaphragm stops moving as one piece, breaks up into its own modes, and distorts. Voishvilo sidestepped the whole thing with 2 annular diaphragms and 2 voice coils working together. They called it the D2, and it debuted in a concert sound system. In January 2013, JBL dropped it into a studio monitor. The M2, 2 ways, a 15-inch woofer, and the D2, 1 single seam, at 800 Hz, 20 Hz to 40,000, 123 dB at 1 meter. And in front of the D2, the piece that justifies all of it, the image control waveguide. Its stated job isn't to flatten the response out front, It's to keep it neutral off-axis, above, below, and to the sides, all the way down to that 800 Hz crossover. There it is. That's the thing JBL stopped chasing. For decades, the industry chased the flat curve measured from the front. The M2 doesn't win the fight against the room. It wins by deciding, precisely, what it hands the room. It's the answer to the problem Lansing raised and never solved. A monitor stops lying when you control what bounces. A pair, with the amplifiers, runs about $25,000. And then JBL did the last thing anybody expected. It took the geometry of that waveguide, the one from the $25,000 monitor, and put it in a $149 speaker. The LSR 305, $300 a pair. Somebody mixing in a bedroom, holding the same answer to the dispersion problem as a mastering room. Then came the 7 series, the 705P and the 708P, with the same part and new drivers. And for the first time in its entire history, JBL wasn't copying anybody. In 1937, while Lansing was building the Iconic in Los Angeles, a book designer in New York who played violin as a hobby was building the other end of the chain. Because a speaker does absolutely nothing on its own, somebody had to invent what goes in front of it. That first machine of his ended up in the permanent collection of the Smithsonian. 30 years later, he sold his company for just under $31 million. And today, his name is on a concert hall at Lincoln Center. His full story is on screen.